Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, cooperative members working together to generate power so you can enjoy the benefits of life in central and western Kansas. Sunflower Electric Power Corporation, energy done right.
Good evening and welcome to the Kansas Legislature, our Friday evening call-in talk show on politics and proceedings of the Kansas Legislature in Topeka. I'm your host, Jay Steinmetz, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Fort Hays State University and a Policy Fellow at the Docking Institute. We've got another great show lined up tonight, and I want to welcome two representatives of the Kansas House of Representatives. First, we have Representative Stephen Howe of the 71st District, that encompasses parts of Salina. And we have Representative Stephen Johnson back for another episode from the 108th District in Assyria, and just last night had announced his candidacy for state treasurer. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Excited to have that.
Welcome, representatives, and thank you for being here. So let's talk some economic development. Let's talk some taxes, first of all. Laura Kelly signed some bills into law, 4 economic development bills that she had already received. Her words on that is that recovery from COVID-19, it's an opportunity to build a stronger, healthier, more resilient workforce. Some updates to the high performance incentive program, extending the angel investor tax credit that helps startup companies in the state, expanding types of projects allowed in the Kansas rural housing incentive districts. Some important pieces, potentially.
That is one of the reasons I voted against 3 of the 4 bills that she signed.
And we'll have plenty of time here for taxes in a moment. Representative Johnson, thoughts on what has been signed? Is that enough? How can we move the state forward economically?
Yeah, so it's a step. There are more things that we do through the programs. To move forward economically, much of the progress is made even in our local communities as we get a sense for what we're able to do and how we do it. The state programs can help. Sometimes the best we can do is get out of the way. I think what we need to do better with all of the programs that we have is continue to measure and look at those impacts. With the angel investor credit, it's one that's very well liked. It had a lot of support that was there. We didn't have a lot of data on it, and I voted for it. I voted for it in that I would like to continue it. However, if I had the perfect version, I would not have expanded it or increased it. I would say let's continue to do what we're doing to provide that and see if it's actually moving the dial, in that there is a cost to those programs. And is the cost of that program more than what we would get from another program, whether it's economic development or other supports that we need, whether it's shoring up what we need in mental health or a variety of outcomes, or simply leaving the money in the local communities to do what they need to do with it, rather than picking winners in those programs can absolutely work, but it may or may not be the most efficient. The changes to the HPIP program, the high performance incentive credits that you made, get a handle on. But how do we get a sense that it was that credit that made that particular investment happen? Or did I make a more marginal investment happen that might not last through that versus if I just did it in the private market? And another thing that I think was weak on that program are the clawbacks, which is, say I give you the angel investor credit and that is a benefit, but you either move or sell the business out of state. And now I no longer have that benefit in Kansas, but it is somewhere else. I think we have to be active at recapturing that when the long-term commitment isn't here to get the full payback. Those are the 2 things that I'd like to have more certainty around to be excited about expanding the program.
Yeah, the art of policy and public policy and public administration is measuring and evaluating the outcomes and going from there.
And it's not easy.
Yeah.
It is not easy. That first one is really, that's hard to objectively measure, but I think it's important too. The out-of-state one is pretty black and white. We just need to make sure the measures are there to make sure we don't lose that investment.
let's get into taxes. You mentioned taxes, Representative Howe. Governor Laura Kelly this afternoon vetoed the tax cut bill sent to her by the legislature, saying that it was a tax cut for the wealthy and that her rejected tax proposal for the session would have brought tax breaks to a greater number of Kansans. The estimate from her office was 94%. Thoughts on the governor's veto? You voted for the tax bill. So rationale for why the vote was there. Thoughts on the veto moving forward, Representative Howe?
Sure. I did learn this afternoon that the Kansas House Republican leadership has indicated that they will try to see if we can override that veto when we get back on May 3rd. I'm not sure exactly what date it will be, maybe sometime after May 3rd. But there are some good things in the legislation which would close some loopholes as it relates to online marketplace facilitators and would bring in additional revenue to the state. But maybe perhaps the bill was too wide in scope and maybe it needs to be narrowed a little bit in order to get buy-in from more legislators.
Yeah, the measure contained provisions that the governor had sought last year, a reduction in standard deductions for individual income tax payers that costs about $83 million in lost revenues in the upcoming fiscal year, collection from the internet market facilitators. I think that was what you had mentioned there. So there were some pieces in there that the governor had supported. And you mentioned they're going to go ahead and try to do an override. It looks like a veto override majority in the Senate. They originally voted 30-10. In the House, it's going to be a little iffy. 81-43 was the original vote, not enough for an override. Where do you get those votes from in the House, Representative Johnson? How do you convince some of your constituents, some of your colleagues, maybe bring in some more bipartisan support for it? Thoughts on that?
It'll be a challenge. It'd be a challenge to get the bipartisan support, I think. There certainly are pieces that are there, but to do that specific bill, I think it's hard to change the number of votes. I'm sure that the House leadership is working on that particular problem. But as Stephen said, there are pieces that virtually everyone would like somewhere in that bill. And to the House's credit, the size of the cost or fiscal note was about a fourth of what the cost was of the version that came over from the Senate. So many of the things were taken out to try and pare it down to those things. But when you're looking at the standard deduction, which would affect many of the income tax filers, virtually all, the ability to deduct expenses in Kansas, to itemize deductions, whether or not you did federally, actually is something that came to us from a couple of our Democrat colleagues when it first happened. The challenge of implementing it is probably as much of a concern as the cost of implementing it. But then you get into some of the other items that are a little more challenging, the certain international tax and decoupling that while coupling the net operating loss components. I would argue you might want to be consistent on, are you going to try and follow the federal code and stay coupled, or are you going to not and decouple more things? You don't want too many chances where you pick and choose what's optimal, or you start getting more of a Swiss cheese tax code.
Yeah. Well, we have the disadvantage in this country of having a pretty convoluted tax code with a lot of different layers. And I've tried to wrap my head around this decoupling thing, and maybe you can provide for our viewers a little bit of a better understanding of this decoupling the individual income tax deductions from the federal deductions. As currently as it stands, if I'm correct here, and you can correct me on this one, if a taxpayer chooses to use the federal income tax deductions, there's a cap on the amount of state income tax deductions available to Kansans. What would decoupling do? Who would it probably affect more? My understanding is this is a smaller percentage of Kansans who would utilize this. Some detail on that, Representative Johnson?
So it is a smaller percentage of Kansans, but if I can take one step back and get to the decoupling piece, we are what's called a rolling conformity state on our tax code, which means that when there's a change federally, the default for Kansas is to change to that federal code. So decoupling means we're no longer following, we're doing our own thing. Well, we were coupled on the itemized deductions and followed that code. When the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act went through and increased the standard deduction at the federal level, if you didn't take the itemized deduction on your federal, you couldn't take it on your state return. Well, now it is those folks who single 12,000, married 24,000. If your itemized deductions weren't at that level, you could no longer itemize. So I would say the wealthier were still able to itemize, and that mid-range that could barely itemize to what now the standard deduction is was the one that lost the deduction. So decoupling then says, okay, regardless of what you do on the federal, if you qualify with expenses above the standard deduction, you can itemize on your state return. That's what that group does. So yes, it would be higher incomes than those who cannot itemize or have a need to itemize.
But not the highest incomes.
Not the highest incomes. And in particular, you might have somebody that hits a year where there are medical expenses or a variety of different things that some of us would be sensitive to say, I wish they could itemize. And then there are other cases where you say, wow, but that's one of the larger parts of the fiscal note. Can we afford it?
Just to remind our viewers here, this is a call-in show. We appreciate and welcome your calls on any policy or politically related questions here with the Kansas Legislature. Our phone number is 1-800-337-4788. That number is 1-800-337-4788. We look forward to your calls. Governor Kelly's veto of the tax bill, concern from the Democrats that this is a return to the Brownback experiment. In fact, Governor Kelly had mentioned that directly, which saw cut in support for certain expenses in exchange for tax cuts for wealthier individuals. Response to that, Representative Howe? I mean, what's the rationale here for tax cuts for corporations, businesses, maybe on the wealth side? What benefit is that for overall for state of Kansas? And some response to Governor Kelly's suggestion there, and it's a kind of return to the Brownback model?
I don't think it's a return to the Brownback model, in particular to this legislation. I do think coming out of a year where there's been a lot of job losses, a lot of uncertainty out in the private sector, I think this is a fairly balanced approach that would hopefully retain and grow businesses and allow for opportunities for Kansans looking for work.
Let's dig into taxes.
I might dig into that one a little just more.
Of course.
I would say it is a misstatement to say it's a return to the Brownback era. The LLC loophole that we had at the time to stimulate businesses was more open-ended in that people could potentially change the nature of their income, which affected what the size of that was. As we look at the cost of this, much more limited. The part that would be tax-free that I think you could draw a corollary to would be what's called the global intangible low-taxed income, which is a confusing thing that really none of us fully understand. And in fact, the Fed said, we don't understand it. We're going to pull it all in and give you an 80% credit, right? Because we don't know what you're doing, but we think some of it should be taxed here. So putting that on the tax-free, our limit in that is more in the 40 million range, which is still a real cost, but it's not as open-ended as the other one that was there. Certainly that's a benefit for those businesses. Certainly it is something on which they did not have to pay income tax before. And they're reacting to that. Very few states tax that. So from a competitive angle, that was a concern. From a policy angle, that's where one of the inconsistencies are. This was brought into income, several other write-offs were given against it. If I want to stay consistent with the federal income, now I'm picking and choosing. I get the benefits from the federal, but not then the income that would be included in that one. But much more limited. Very few companies actually have this global income, which would result from I manufacture a product in Hayes, but I have a subsidiary in Eastern Europe, and the product on paper transfers to Eastern Europe and then transfers to Germany, and somewhere it goes from $1 a unit to $10 a unit. Where was the value at? And that is what it is intending to capture. But if you think of the number of companies that are affected by that here, far different than the LLC work that had been done in the previous administration.
Yeah, good detail here, and from
Maybe
Eastern
not for
Europe
our
to
listeners.
I think you used to chair the tax committee, is that right?
I was familiar with that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully our viewers are still awake. Tax policy is not the most exciting thing in the world. But let's pause on taxes and get a caller here. Nick from Victoria is on line one. Nick, good evening. What is your question?
Yes, my question was related to the tax issue that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And I know COVID has caused some issues with the state budget, and I'm wondering how this income tax cut that was proposed that you were talking about would affect that. And I know there were concerns on the federal side with the COVID relief and states doing exactly what you're doing by decreasing, income taxes at the state level. And my final question is, why would sales tax not be addressed as part of this as well?
Great questions there, Nick. In terms of the pandemic and the concern about our tax obligations, there's a legitimate concern there. And I was going to mention sales tax. 58.5% of Kansans in the Kansas Speaks survey that was published by the Docking Institute last fall, 2020, 58.5% of Kansans felt as though their tax burden went up last year. And amongst that group, 50% favored lowering the sales tax. And we've got a pretty regressive sales tax in the state of Kansas. So thoughts on the sales tax there, and thoughts more generally about how this bill that was vetoed by Governor Kelly, potentially an override by the legislature, might be a good response to some of the economic things we saw coming out of the pandemic. Representative Howe?
Well, in terms of the sales tax, I'm not sure why that wasn't maybe addressed in this bill, but maybe perhaps because it would have made the bill even harder to get through, perhaps, and it would have broadened the scope of it too much. But I do think, looking at tax policy, we need to look at ways that we can reduce that burden. We've heard the governor, when she ran for office the first time, that she wanted to do away with the food sales tax. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen any meaningful path forward to seeing that happen. She just signed several bills today, economic development bills. But I would think that if perhaps those things weren't there for economic development, perhaps then we could get a path forward on the sales tax, because you're taking revenue away from the state general fund for these credits, whether it's also star bonds and things like that. When you do that, there's less to work with. And so I think it would be nice to see a path forward to lower that sales tax that affect all Kansans doing business.
Representative Johnson, thoughts on that sales tax, and then also,
yes.
The bill here that
Yeah.
Governor Kelly signed. How is it a response to some of the economic dislocations we saw in the pandemic?
Great, and Nick, thanks for the question. I'll try and make sure that I get that answered as well. But I think the first part was kind of the income tax cut, COVID, and the impact of that. Given that we were worried about revenues, still have some concern about revenues. Surprisingly, last year was above our projections. So we were some $200 million above our estimates in last year in total taxes. So to your point, people feel their tax burden went up because their tax burden went up. Mm-hmm. There was actually more activity than we thought there would be. So it wasn't on a percentage basis, but on a dollar basis it did. So that $200 million in increase that we have, and of course we're not through the year, so we don't know that. Perhaps that'll fall off. I think it'll actually increase from that. On this bill, would take $100 million of that away. So we'd still be net up some amount. So probably north of 100 or 150 million. Doesn't make it the right thing or not, but the tax cut offset in part by the tax on internet sales, as Representative Howe mentioned. And so the net of that with the economic activity happens to be a positive and looks like it will continue. Doesn't make it the right policy, because the next point you made is the feds said with COVID relief that's coming out, you accept the money, you can't cut taxes. So would those parts of the bill that were not in place at the beginning of the year qualify as that, and will the feds have the ability to shut that down? So there are some states that will fight whether or not that can happen. I don't know. I don't know if that can stand under that, given that we will accept those funds that are coming out. Another large influx that will create more economic activity. There's $1.6 billion coming to the state general fund. There's $1.1 to local general aid. There's $1.1 billion to K-12 and other things. So it's a real influx of money that will drive economic activity in the short term. I don't know how that'll play out long term. Sales tax was a part, again, in the internet sales, and where oftentimes I've seen the tax committee get tied up is a sales tax cut. If you're going to take a 50 million cut to sales tax, it doesn't change the rate very much, and people ended in that quickly. And what we saw come out of the tax committee were more targeted impacts that had specific impacts for some. I won't say that that's right or wrong, but the cuts were there rather than to the sales tax piece, but a good question. But again, the burden is up. Our revenues are higher than even. I'm not overly surprised that they're above the estimates, because the estimates were revised down due to COVID, but that they're above last year is surprising me.
Some cautious optimism potentially on the budget.
Yeah.
Let's one more quick question about taxes and linking taxes to public education and higher education. So in that same Kansas Speak survey, 50.1% of respondents prefer either higher taxes and spending or keeping the current level of taxes and spending the same. Only 24.4% for higher, the rest of that for keeping the taxes and spending the same. 49.8% preferred lower taxes and lower spending. So a fairly divided opinion on that. What sort of tax climate are we headed for in the next 2 years, in particular with public education? There's a difficult tension there with funding public education and funding higher education, two separate issues. But where do you see the tax climate shift to public education next 2 or 5 year window out? Representative Howe, your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to forecast what the tax climate might be. I do know there's a lot of, as Representative Johnson mentioned, there's a lot of federal dollars coming into our state. I think just earlier this governor announced $16 billion coming into the state of Kansas to provide some relief to those in the hospitality and entertainment venue industry. But as it relates to education and the tax environment moving forward, I don't know, but the COVID-19 pandemic has been if there's a silver lining in it, it's challenged people to do things a little bit differently. Higher educational institutions and as well as K-12 education, they've developed online platforms to deliver education. Now, I think in the K-12 arena, perhaps that's not as effective. But I've talked to some college students that said because of the online platform at the university, they had to work even harder, and they felt like they got a better education because they had to do more work on their own to keep up with the curriculum. So I think we need to look at the policy and how we're going to deliver and utilize.
The end of this month with the new consensus revenue estimate, so we'll try and get a handle on where that is. If it's flat, we're in a world that we can continue to exist, and it is flat for this. We'll be fine for 21. 22 is where we have the concern. 23 is where we would be out of money in the projections potentially. So if there is an increase that continues at a rapid rate after this scheduled increase that we have, it will be very difficult to not have some increase in revenue from somewhere. Just to meet the K-12 piece and keep the rest that are there. It will be very hard for higher ed to see increases in that particular world. So that will drive pressure on tax rates. Kansas is one of the higher tax states. We don't have any particular things that help us in revenue uniquely. It's just us making those payments and paying for things. And ultimately, while it is the courts, while it is the legislature, it comes back to just us, all of us, deciding what do we want to invest in education? Mm-hmm. What are we willing to do? And it's not so much does the court have it right, does the legislature have it right? But this last year has been difficult for everybody, educators particularly, and there are a lot of people who have just worked their tail off in whatever type of school it is, and we're thankful for that. But we probably have to continually, and I think we probably learned some hard but useful lessons in saying, okay, just like with those economic development programs, let's just be as open as we can about where we're getting the results we want, what we want to have happen, and how we continue to integrate the needs of the workforce with the opportunities of education and make those what we are able to invest in sustainably.
Just briefly, the thoughts on higher education. What value does it return to Kansas and Kansans in terms of higher education? I speak of Votech Community College, four-year universities. Can you pinpoint, for our viewers out there, what kind of value does that pay in give back to Kansas? Representative Johnson?
And I don't know that I can pinpoint what the payback from higher education is. There have been more focused efforts on the VOTEC and technical education to fill a lot of jobs that are needed now, and so those have been shown more, and greater investment has been made in those. There's been more confidence in those investments staying in state. We have a lot of great four-year institutions, and there is absolutely value there, but continuing to figure that out over time is probably going to include more focus at institutions to say, what are we truly great at? And good may or may not be as much of an option. And so as we invest in each of those areas, there's absolutely returns. It's unique to each individual, but I think more students are going to be making the economic decision of what can I afford in terms of expenses and time in that. But I probably should have more data on exactly what we return from higher education, but I'll bet I could even get some information from Hayes that would give me a great pinpoint of what we get back from each dollar.
And I might be able to help with that.
That sounds good.
Remarks on that, Representative Howe? Thoughts in general, value that our investments in higher education?
Sure. As I understand it, I've been in office for about 4 months, so I'm still learning a lot. But as I understand, 52% or 52 cents on every dollar that is collected by the state is spent on education. And so that is a huge sum of money that we're talking about that goes towards education. And oftentimes we just get caught up in talking about money, but what about students? And right now in K through 12 education, according to the Kansas Board of Regents, anywhere from, I think it's 77% to 80% of students that graduate are not career and college ready. And that's a huge problem. And so what do we need to do in order to have better outcomes so they are ready to go to a secondary educational experience, whether it's Fort Hays State University or K-State Polytechnic or Salina Area Technical College. And so I think we can do better, but if we get caught up in the money issues all the time, I think that sets us back a little bit.
Great comments there, and a good segue into civics education requirement. But before I do, a note again to all you viewers out there, this is a call-in show. We appreciate your questions. Our number is 1-800-337-4788. That number for a call-in show is 1-800-337-4788. Let's discuss civics education requirement bill that passed the legislature on Governor Kelly's desk. The question as to whether or not she's going to sign this bill. The bill would require high school students in Kansas to pass a 60-question multiple choice civics exam in order to graduate. I believe that requirement goes into effect in 2022 or so, to give a little time for school districts to be prepared for it. I think those multiple choice questions come straight from the citizenship exam, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think Governor Kelly is going to sign this? And what's the rationale for the legislation? Why pass a civics requirement? Representative Howe, you first on that one?
Sure. As I understand it, Jay, there's a growing interest amongst Kansans in seeing and ensuring that their students that graduate from high school here in the state of Kansas have a basic level of understanding as it relates to civics. And I think that's a very healthy goal. Whether or not this 60 question multiple choice test is the best format, I don't know, but it is a starting point for us to discuss it and see what we can do to improve some of those outcomes.
Yeah, some of the states, so I dug into this a little bit. There's 16 states in the United States that have a civics exam requirement, and some of the states who have implemented it in the earliest have now developed more qualitative assessments, volunteer programs, or other things that are associated with it, not just an exam. But as a starting point here, is this the rationale for the legislation? Did you support this, Representative Johnson, and thoughts on it?
So I did not happen to support it, so I should have gotten some of your data before, because you might have changed my mind. But anyway, I looked at it and I agree. It's a good thing. And I'd like to see that there. I am hesitant from the legislature to add too many mandates to what schools have to do. And it was that hesitancy where I felt that the schools were in a better position. I think there's a role for the state school board and say, okay, how do we make sure that all of the things that we want in the curriculum are there? And I'd love to see something like this, but I don't know enough of the other parts that have to be there to say, okay, I want to make sure you stop and cover it.
So from your perspective, it's the local option is a valuable perspective on
Right.
politics, and
Right.
often localities know better. Is this kind of a local option issue for you in the sense of allowing
Yeah.
school districts to determine whether or not that's feasible?
So two pieces. One is very much that I do think that local control matters in those, and I want to be careful where we step on it. I think there are times where you do pass policies such as this and others to say, here's some overriding things that we want to achieve. But there are several, for me, not being as well versed in what that entire curriculum is and knowing how hard it is to complete all of the things that are there, I don't want to add another test that isn't among the most critical priorities that have to be achieved. So that was the concern.
And I'm not sure I asked you, Representative Howe, did you vote for this civics requirement?
Yes, I did. I did vote for it, and I think it's interesting because when you're on the House floor, especially on some of these days that we have a lot of votes coming our way, you have to digest a lot of information in a short amount of time. So it's easy for me to see where Steve and I could differ a little bit, but at the same time, we don't differ that much. We basically have a common understanding on local control and things like that. On another bill, I voted to retain local control as it relates to sending kids back to school. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I think, a good starting point, and it'll be interesting to see what the governor says.
Yeah, can you read the tea leaves for me on this one? You voted for it. What do you think the odds are that Governor Kelly signs this? There's some pushback from teachers and from teachers' unions, somewhat similar, but in terms of just capacity and other things. Do you think that sways Governor Kelly to vote no, or?
It's hard to say. I'm not very good at speculating what she will do or not do, and so I really don't have a good feel. But part of that bill also dealt with financial literacy as well. Mm-hmm. Some very real-world things that could help, I guess, young adults understand a little bit more about credit and making wise financial decisions when they have to leave the nest or the comfort of mom and dad's house.
Yeah, crucial components there. More broadly speaking now, not just civics education requirement, but how do we get young people engaged in democracy? How do we get young people running for office? How do we get them informed about government and democratic process? It's obviously complicated. It's thick. There's a lot there to think about it. But what are some steps that we can take? If it's not a mandated exam, Representative Johnson, where do you see this? Are there more qualitative measures and maybe not mandates that can be taken to improve civics literacy, political engagement, and that sort of thing?
Political engagement has always been a challenging one, and you might actually have some data on whether that's changed. As our voter turnout has increased, I would wonder if more young and people across the ages have engaged more recently. I wonder if social media has facilitated that engagement. I wonder if social media sometimes misdirects that engagement on all sides. I'm not saying that there's any one, but it's so easy to get inundated with a fraction of the information that making those informed choices may actually be harder. And so I think there's probably two pieces. One is how do we continue to engage more people, but at the same time, how do we continue to engage more people well? And make sure that democracy is based on an engaged and informed citizenry. And it's important that we are informed on the same basic details and facts, not that we interpret them the same, but the truth and the facts are something we share, and then from those work to create our shared vision, and then win or lose, work together on that shared vision. And I fear that from young to older, we have become more engaged on working on my vision, and I'm not exempt from it. I can't call any one of us out differently, but that part is exciting when I hear those messages from different places, and again, not from unique places. I've been encouraged to hear them from various places. But then the next piece is to not only hear the message, but see if there's actually a process that has the dialogue that results in that shared vision. That, I think, is a game changer that I would love to see.
Yeah, and as a teacher of political science, I see this in the classroom, and I teach polarization and partisanship both at the upper division level, and it's a conversation we have at the lower division level, and we live in a very polarized society.
We have it at the family level sometimes.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. Of course.
So
yep.
how do
yep.
we?
The infamous Thanksgiving dinner political conversation.
But please continue it.
In those conversations, I've asked students, and I was surprised just this term that many students in a particular political issues course had said that they feel their generation is even more polarized. I don't think the data backs that up, but I think there's some sense out there of partisan entrenchment, even amongst younger people, of politics getting too toxic in the sense of partisan trench warfare. And I think that is a big piece that you mentioned. Democracy, vital to democracy, is a well-informed democracy. How do we inform the public? How do we have a well-informed public in an era of which we've got a problem of disinformation and misinformation and information silos on the internet where people are sort of locked into one particular view? Thoughts on that, Representative Howe?
Yeah. I grew up and for 11 years spent time in 4-H. And with my local 4-H club, I learned a lot about civics. I learned a lot about parliamentary procedure. I participated in gavel games and all sorts of fun and educational opportunities. And my first trip was a citizenship Washington focus trip up to Washington, D.C. in the early 90s. It was my first time taking an airplane, and people from all over the country came up to Chevy Chase, Maryland, and we did kind of like a mock Congress, and we learned about how to debate, how to, I guess, talk about issues and things like that in a very civil way. And so I think programs like 4-H do help promote that type of dialogue. And so when it comes to social media, I do think that is a problem. You see those information silos, whether it's Facebook or some other platform, where you get locked into just your group of people, and all you hear about is those talking points and those pieces of information. So I think we need to break out of that. I think there are some platforms looking to do that, but it is a very complicated thing. So,
yeah, it's a tough piece, and something that just can't simply be legislated.
Yeah. I'm glad Representative Howe mentioned 4-H. That was where I learned how to run a meeting. So now in committee you can tell whether or not it's stuck or not. Right. But 4-H today still has some great programs where they take on really hard issues and debate them in a very mature way. So that is encouraging, and I hope more of that happens. I'd be curious, you mentioned that young people are more polarized. So as I'm getting older, how do we define young? What was the age range where we were starting to notice that? Did you happen to get any of that data?
Well, it's interesting. We throw around this word millennials all the time, and it's such a huge group. It's such a demographic that, in fact, within it, from folks born in 1998 or 99 to folks born in 1981, there's big differences in there. So, I think in a lot of the data that is out there, partisanship is a problem that crosses across the age divide. But when we talk about our boomer generation, who's now been in political leadership for quite a long time, the numbers in the public with regards to the boomer generation are not very good in terms of polarization and partisanship. It seems to be a particularly polarized generation, a lot of data suggests. So, this is a problem that we've been talking about the younger folks and their engagement in politics, but it's also engagement at all different sorts of age groups and levels. And I've said this in my class about President Donald Trump. Love him, former President Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he brought millions of new voters into the process that were really felt disengaged for a long time. Let's jump to another issue here real quickly. Before I do, I want to mention that phone number again. We'd love to hear from you. It's a call-in show, 1-800-337-4788. That phone number is 1-800-337-4788. On a note of bipartisanship, for just a brief moment, instead of talking about partisanship all the time, labor jobless bill passed 38-0 in the Senate, 122-0 in the House. I don't see any no votes there. And this was to replace the 40-year-old computers that handled the unemployment compensation programs and other Department of Labor operations. It seems like the constituents' communication that you're getting has a lot to do with these unemployment claims, Department of Labor. Is this going to fix the problem? Is there more that needs to be done here? Representative Howe, you first.
Yes, when I first was sworn in on January 11th, the phones were ringing, and it was about unemployment compensation. A lot of people trying to get through to file claims that they were legitimately entitled for. This is a safety net for a very specific reason, and for those that have lost jobs or employment. And many of those couldn't get through to file their claims. Additionally, there was a record amount of fraudulent claims being put through the system. And unfortunately, a lot of the trust fund was drained. And that's a real unfortunate problem. Currently, as of this week, there are over 17,000 claims for pandemic unemployment assistance. And of those, 76% are considered backlogged, which means that they have been in the system for over 21 days. And so that is not acceptable. We're still working on reducing that backlog. And I kind of picture it like a winter storm, and there's a 100-car pileup. That's what it seems to have happened with this old 40-year-old IT infrastructure system. And so this legislation addresses that. It also provides some different oversight, establishes a unemployment council to help implement this new bill. So I was pleased that it gained such bipartisan support.
Thoughts, Representative Johnson? Enough? Where do we go from here? More to be done?
So enough, no. Where do we go from here? It goes back to the agency problem, unfortunately. So the bill did so many things. There is so much in that bill, all the way to changing the schedule of payments by the employers to make sure that the trust fund stays solvent, particularly in light of right now and the losses in the fund and going forward. That's a major change in the schedules. Just a lot of details that are there. Is it a help? Absolutely. To fix it, it's not fixed. So let's go back through the whole problem, and those are great details on where we are now and the backlog that still exists. A year ago, we were getting 23,000 initial claims a week. That's a lot for Kansas. Was there a ton of fraud in it at that point? We don't know. Probably some. I don't know if it's a lot. At the peak, we were getting 66 to low 70,000 initial claims a week. You know that can't be right. We've got 3 million people, and a run rate of that weekly is over 100% of your population that's unemployed. So we were at the height of fraud. And that was absolutely going on. We installed the patch, the fix, on a weekend in January after the legislature came in mid-January and said, this can't work. And we immediately went down. Last week we had, was it 1,600, 1,700 claims? Or 2 weeks ago, last week, we went back up to 2,500. That is the run rate where we are. We are low. Our unemployment is low. So, and even with those low numbers coming in to the 100-car pileup, we're not getting it done. And we just have to get it done. So I've had several calls with the department. Again, like other areas, good people who are working their brains out trying to figure out how to get something in this process is not working. And we can point to it and say, okay, it's your fault, or fix it. But my point has been, how do we work together? You tell me, the calls come in, where do they go? Where is this not getting through? Do we need to stop, have the legislature spend more money, hire a call center to take it out until you can clear this logjam and get a lane open and bring it back? Again, I don't need to hear half an hour of argument about why it's not working. I need to figure out what we can do together to make it work for the people that are there. And to have those conversations with legislators are even hard with because they are so buried in the challenge of getting rid of the backlog. And we've got to figure out a way through that and not let it happen again. I wish I could say it's just the systems, and as soon as that's fixed, it'll work. But something is not working in the call center and how we're processing those claims.
Good thoughts. Let's squeeze in a caller here. Melinda from Luray is on line 1. Good evening, Melinda. What is your question?
Yeah, I was wondering what the legislators' opinions are or view of the Medicaid expansion offered by the Biden administration.
Great question there. So the stimulus package created more sweeteners and incentives for the states to accept Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion is popular amongst Kansans. Kansas Speak survey suggests around 65% supported Medicaid expansion prior to the new stimulus bill that was signed into law by the Biden administration. But there's more federal sweeteners there. Is this a time to reflect on this? Your position on this one, Representative Howe, we haven't had you on the show before. What are your thoughts about Medicaid expansion? Are you supportive of it?
I'm supportive of looking for ways that we can reduce the cost of healthcare services for people despite their insurance status. I haven't been around in the legislature long enough to have that history of knowledge about how the Medicaid debate has gone, but I generally have reservations about that and the cost it would be to the state out of the state general fund, because there's already a lot of obligations that we have as a state, and so I'm not sure long term if we could afford that. So I would be, I guess, a little bit more reserved, but I would welcome the conversation because, people, I think, need to have that safety net because I have 4 boys of my own, and healthcare is very expensive. And so having something to backstop that is very important.
Yeah, the state buy-in would be about $50 million for Medicaid expansion. The federal federal contribution to that to the state of Kansas would be $350 million. It's a lot of federal dollars. It ensures a lot of lower income people. You've been on the show before, Representative Johnson, supportive of Medicaid expansion. That federal sweetener make your support stronger. And from your perspective, being a supporter of Medicaid expansion, how do we get it done?
Well, that second one's a tough question, but there's 3 things I'd like to hit all around that, if I may. First, if it's Melinda from Lorain, I want to say thanks for watching and calling in again. And I tried to give a call back, and I have the wrong number for you. I should send an email on the previous issue when I was headed to Abilene on the Heritage Area Partnership. So I'd love to talk to you about that also. And then on this one, does it change my position? Pretty much the same. It doesn't. I think the numbers are able to work. The hospitals were willing to work with us. Now it seems to make more sense financially as I look at it selfishly from the Kansas standpoint. I don't know that cost concern is as great a concern with the sweeteners that are offered, which has been one of the resistances that my colleagues have had to it. The 90-10 match has always been one that I'd consider. Again, from a federal level, I don't know how I would pay for it. I'm concerned about the 1.9 trillion. I am concerned about the expansion. But with 12 states not expanding, my opinion is it is the law of the land and will continue to be the law of the land. And
Take those dollars if they're there.
with all four surrounding states having expanded, I'm concerned about being able to pay our healthcare workers competitive wages to make those careers stay here where we need them. Again, I'd like to believe that there are other options, but I think it's leading us to a point where that's part of what we do, and waiting may not serve us well. But this is a hot issue with a lot of folks, and I don't pretend that I have the answer. But anyway.
Continued discussion on that one. Let's squeeze in one more issue here. This is an important one nationwide and here in Kansas. The Kansas Legislature passed a bill that bans transgender athletes from participating in women's sports. This passed the Senate 26-11. It passed the House 76-32. Debates were heated and emotional on this one. Difficult issue. Did you vote for this bill, and what's the rationale here? Let's start with Representative Howe.
Yes, thank you for the question. It was probably one of the most uncomfortable bills to kind of dive into, because it becomes very personal to a lot of people, and I saw that on the House floor. But I think because of some things happening in other states, we decided to pursue this bill. Generally speaking, I do think it makes sense that girls in high school sports should play girls' sports. And I don't think, a boy who is a transgender girl should be playing in those sports. And so this just clarifies, absent a solid uniform policy by the Kansas Department of Education, it clarifies that. And, it's a strange issue to have to consider. So
It's an important one for a lot of folks and personal. Did you vote for it, Representative Johnson? What's the rationale here?
Yeah, I did vote for it, and it is such a sensitive issue. And it's one where heard it on the floor, tried to listen to the debate that was there. The committee piece and exactly how the bill is written, I'm not sure that I can go deep enough to get there. I agree with Representative Howe, and that was the reason for my vote, that in the event that someone would truly have a physical competitive advantage in a sport, I don't think that's something we would want to allow. Has not been a problem that I'm aware of in the state. I generally think it probably would not, but I wish it was one, again, such a tough issue. How do we talk about the fact that, yes, we don't want someone who has a clear advantage to take advantage of that in the state, but how do we say we're not going to do that, and yet with compassion say how do we make sure that everyone feels heard, understood, and has a place to participate?
Well, we've covered a lot of issues tonight, and a good substantive debate. More to talk about, obviously. It feels like we just get started sometimes and some nights. This is Jay Steinmetz here with the Kansas Legislature. Thank you to our representatives for being on the show, and we'll see you next time. So long. Good.
I made you do a short wrap-up.
That's okay. You did good. No, you did.